Good evening, and welcome to episode 6 of Behind the Secret Curtain, the life and death of a record label. On tonight's episode, we will be discussing indie labels and covering several more releases from my catalog, along with more of the usual and increasing bullshit. So let's get on with it. A lot of people have asked me, if the majors are so hard to work with, why not try the indie labels? Well, let me tell you my experience with indie labels. First, let's start with Domino. Domino owned the Lena Love catalog, and being one of my absolute favorite artists, she was one of the first I thought of trying to license, even before I had anything else licensed and released. I contacted Domino in July 2017. Initial communication was very polite and understandable. He asked for details and a proposal. After reviewing that I had yet to have a release and that my distribution plans were through CD Baby since I hadn't yet signed with a real distributor, he suggested that I get a few releases out and then come back for re-evaluation. Fair enough. I checked back in with Domino in November 2018 after I had 6 titles released and real distribution. At the time, they took the opportunity to inform me they owned a portion of the Visage publishing and that they wanted me to work with them on paying their portion. I explained about the finished goods deals and that Universal handled the publishing payments on those types of deals. He wasn't aware of that sort of deal, being the UK didn't work that way, and I put them in contact with Universal. We seemed to be making progress on coming to a deal. My plan was to start with a 40th anniversary 2-CD edition of the album Stateless with both mixes of the album. The original mix and the better-known remix. The impression I was given is that they owned the master rights, but didn't have any actual master tapes in their possession. This was going to be built through existing CD sources and vinyl transfers for what had not yet been on CD. I then got word that Lena preferred to only have the original mix of Stateless put out, feeling that the better-known remix version had already been well covered on previous reissues. We went back and forth, and then the spokesperson at the time for Lena was making a public spectacle about the proposed reissue, or how he felt the catalog owner was somehow at fault. Note that this spokesperson is the same one who felt advertising a box set of Lena's early albums, being compiled to CDR and without disclosing that detail, and dumping it all into something akin to a shoebox was acceptable. Not to mention how many fans wanted refunds after buyers began complaining about this approach, many of which never were refunded. I was one of the early lucky ones. By February 2019, I pulled the plug due to the spokesperson's endless social media ranting and raving, which I felt was going to hurt my potential project. I was a little annoyed with Domino. I was told I would have a response to my proposal by the end of January, but it didn't happen because of Lena's spokesperson throwing such a tantrum. The label was polite about it and suggested we may revisit the idea in the future. Since it originally seemed the release was imminent, I already had the artwork nearly completed. With my label revitalized by early 2020 after a meager 2 reissues in 2019, I checked in with Domino. The immediate response was, after what happened last time, no thanks. A few months later, in August, I notified him that Lena's troublemaking spokesperson had been out of the picture for several months and that people were continuing to inquire about possibly doing the catalog. The response was more inquiries on publishing for several more releases I had done, wanting to ensure I provide payment for those. I again explained that Universal handled most of those as finished goods deals and addressed the publishing. The only one I handled under the new license out deal was the Fingerprints compilation, and I sent him my proof of licensing. No one's trying to rip you off, pal. He asked me if I would send him copies of the 5 CDs he had a publishing interest in, which I did. About a month later, he confirmed he had received the CDs and proceeded to offer a list of critiques. He opened by saying that the remastering was undoubtedly excellent, but that he wasn't happy with my image quality, some of the fonts used, the layout, etc., using terms like clunky or leaves a lot to be desired. He asked if I would be open to using one of their art people on the possible Lena reissue. I can admit that I was learning as I went, but my image quality was not poor at all, though I do admit to approaching the font choices for some of the earlier titles as being a bit out of the ordinary. I can understand that critique. But he went further, referring to my website and my label logo as dated. To me, that's going too far. That's like walking into someone's home and telling them that you hate the way they decorated. It's moving from professional into personal. I didn't want a boring black and white text-based logo, and I have never regretted Ruby the Alien. Are there any other label logos in recent years quite as memorable, regardless of one's personal thoughts on it? He also asked about promotion and distribution. I had mixed emotions about all of this, but got myself in check and offered a very politely detailed response, admitting to being a learning novice with the artwork and that some of my font choices could have been better, and that I would be open to working with additional people on the artwork. But I defended my image quality and layouts. I also went into an unnecessary explanation attempting to justify my website and label logo and the reasons behind them, and assured him I had real distribution. What I should have done is sent him a damn invoice for the 5 CDs plus shipping, because I got absolutely nothing out of our 3-year back and forth. He never replied to my last message, and I never attempted another follow-up. I was surprised he liked my remastering, because of the few Domino CDs I have, I rank them among the most overcompressed, to the point that the bass is distorted no matter what I do. Great albums by FFS, and Austra being tarnished by this heavy-handed approach. Maybe I should send him those critiques. In early 2023, I was contacted by Cherry Red because they had licensed the Lena Love catalog from Domino. This was something I'd been anticipating for some time. The licensing, not the contact. I knew they would eventually get to that catalog. They told me their release plans and that Domino had shared with them my previous interest and the remastering I had already started. They wanted to know if I cared to be involved for the original stateless remastering. After some discussion, I was signed on to remaster the entire 4-CD box set. When I was put in contact with the project manager, I was asked if I wanted to contribute some of my history as a Lena fan for inclusion in the planned booklet. I put my story together and sent it in. There was question how much Lena might be contributing herself to the sleeve notes, so they wanted to have something to fill any void. In the end, Lena provided quite a bit, and some of my notes were scattered throughout the booklet. The remastering all came from various CDs, and a lot of vinyl for anything that hadn't been put to CD previously. All with the same time and care taken as I would for anything on my own label. Being that I was unable to reissue the albums myself, I felt this was the next best option. The box set came out in November 2023, and the first pressing sold out in no time. The feedback was excellent, and fans were very happy to finally have an all-encompassing collection including everything that had been missed over the years. I'm thrilled with the final results, and have no regrets about any of my remastering decisions. 6 years after my first efforts to work on this catalog, the story reached a happy ending. Another indie I attempted to work with was RT Industries, who owned the Vapors catalog after it was divested from Warner. I inquired about licensing the full catalog for reissue. They asked me for a proposal, which I put together and sent them. I was offering an amount equivalent of what the USA majors require, thinking that might be more motivation since I had heard that the UK don't pay the amounts we are required in the USA. After a bit of back and forth, they just said they were not interested in licensing at this time. No surprise, they apparently had a change of heart when Cherry Red came a-knockin' and licensed everything for another of their clamshell box sets. There were a lot of unreleased bits and pieces, but it didn't take long to confirm that they did not have new transfers done for the albums or anything that had a previous CD reissue. They just used the previous Captain Mod CDs as source material. This was confirmed when all of the errors from those CDs carried right over to this box set. Such blunders as the original album mix of News at 10 being replaced with the single remix, that single remix appearing a second time as a bonus track. Or the songs America and Trains from the first album, which merged together on the original LP, being faded out and then back in. By this point, is anyone surprised? I attempted to work with Chrysalis in the UK. The USA signed artists on the Chrysalis label became part of Universal. The UK signed artists remained as an indie label. My interest was to license the albums by Funboy 3. They replied and asked for a proposal. I put together another proposal, only to have them reply and say they will be reissuing the catalog themselves, which they did. Then why was I asked to waste time with a proposal? I attempted to contact Beggar's Banquet multiple times regarding a number of different artists. I could never get a reply. This one might surprise you. Towards the end of my label, getting desperate to add new titles to my catalog, I contacted Cherry Red about licensing a few of the albums by the band Eyeless and Gaza. I'll talk more about these when I get to them in my chronology. As far as licensing goes, my experience with Cherry Red was by far the fastest, easiest, and friendliest licensing experience I would ever have. They were responsive, and the pricing was decent. While I have my opinions on the way they handle the mastering on many of their releases, from a licensing standpoint, they were a dream to deal with. I had inquired about the early Dead or Alive singles they acquired because I wanted to do a better remastering. But since their acquisition was still very new, they were still exploiting it themselves and not yet ready to license. I had contemplated asking about doing a colored vinyl reissue of the original Kim Wilde Very Best Of compilation from 1984, but hadn't pursued the idea before I closed the label down. There are plenty of other indie labels out there, but they don't have much in the way of what interests me. It seems the majority of what I wanted was owned by UMG, so it was a necessary evil. Sony and Warner did have catalogs that I would have liked, but the situations with them were still very restrictive. Warner were still not getting anywhere with UK requests. They had also changed from finished goods to license out deals, and my new licensing contact attempted to get some of my UK requests through, but the foreign offices just won't touch USA reissue requests. This is a double standard, though, because it seems that the UK can ask for a USA signed artist and it will process. People were asking me to reissue the final Boingo album from 1994 on vinyl. This was owned by Warner, but I didn't have much interest in pursuing it at the time. It was eventually licensed to a European label for reissue. Yet again, the non-USA market is able to benefit, while third parties here continue to face an increasing list of restrictions and roadblocks. Both Sony and Warner had changed their licensing pricing calculation from using the wholesale price to the retail price, and that created a significant cost increase. It seems that these labels don't want to tell third parties that they aren't doing third-party licensing anymore, but instead make it so risky that if anyone proceeds, they will likely have a big financial loss unless they have a really good seller that might at least make its money back. The idea of a licensee profiting almost seems offensive to them. You might think, why not just raise the prices of your final product? Because with any price increase comes a further increase in the licensing fee. Not to mention buyers who would shy away from a $35 to $40 LP reissue as the label struggles to make back its investment. It's all being stacked against us in the USA. After the wild enthusiasm over the Boingo Only a Lad LP announcement in early 2021, I sent in LP reissue requests on February 19, 2021 to do the next two in the catalog. Nothing to Fear from 1982 and Good for Your Soul from 1983. Boom! On April 7th, 2021, All of 6 weeks later, I got final clearance for Good for Your Soul. Of course, I wanted to know if Nothing to Fear was coming, since it would be odd to release albums number 1 and 3 without number 2. I didn't get a response. So I ran it by the primary contact on April 14th and then got final clearance later that day. By this point, I had this image in my head that anytime the final clearance person saw an email from me in her inbox, her reaction would be, oh, you gotta laugh at things sometimes. Since Good for Your Soul was the first clearance received, that was the first one to get to the manufacturer. As mentioned during the previous CD reissues, I got the album master from the UK, since it appeared none of the USA album masters survived the fire. It was not the best sound quality, and it took quite a bit of effort to get it sounding good. It's not that the tape was in bad shape, it was just obviously generations down from the masters that were used on the original USA CD, which no longer exist. I used that CD as a guide to at least try to reach or maybe even surpass the quality with the limitations of the source tape I was using. The artwork was tricky because of the border that surrounds the album cover. I spent quite a bit of time creating and extending these little colored shapes to stretch into the bleed areas so I could keep the original image within the safety boundaries and prevent cropping the border out. I wonder how the majors would have handled something like this. Probably just crop the border out. For anyone curious about my basic hardware and programs used for the artwork, I use a somewhat higher end Canon scanner and scan at 600 dpi, or dots per inch. I use various settings within the scanning program to help improve the quality, but it does little in the way of cleaning up dust and specks. Since the scanner size is 8.5 by 14, I have to do 2 scans. For many years, I manually pieced these together in Photoshop, and it was a pain because the 2 scans could have slightly different exposures, and it would be a challenge to balance things out. But then some years ago, I did research and found there's a now defunct free program called Microsoft Ice that was made for this exact purpose. It seamlessly pieces together multiple scans and adjusts the exposure so it looks like a well-balanced image. Next, I will open the image in Photoshop and go through the chore of cleaning it up and repairing any creases or damages, which is the most time-consuming part. There are dust and scratch removal settings, but you need to use them very lightly or they'll start impacting small image details. Much of the cleanup is done manually. I'll also adjust the colors, contrast, brightness, and other settings until it looks pretty good. Then, I'll use my secret weapon add-in to smooth and sharpen further with amazing results, and that one will remain my secret. I don't need to be helping out the majors any more than I already have. I'll often save images of the text used on the original album cover, and then go to several of the various online font identifier websites to try to determine the font, or at least a very close alternative. Some sites are better than others, so if one site doesn't seem to identify the correct font, I'll try another. Once I save my design, I then open the Photoshop file in Adobe Illustrator so I can add the barcode and keep it a vector image along with the text. Vector images are able to be resized without losing resolution, so it holds the very fine detail for things like barcodes and fonts. At the end, I have to right-click all of the fonts and choose to outline them, which helps to prevent any issues on the side of the printer. The final file is saved as a very large press-quality PDF. I followed the design used on Only a Lad and made a picture label with the album cover and converted the inner sleeve to a double-sided insert with the LP in a poly-lined inner sleeve. One color variant I went with was a crystal clear with a magenta splatter. The original idea was to use the greenish blue color and magenta from the back cover of the LP, but they didn't have a color choice that closely matched this, so I opted instead to use clear. For the second variant, I went for translucent orange with yellow splatter. When I received the stock in September 2021, I was generally pleased with it. I found with the clear and magenta variant that a number of copies I opened had only a few splats of magenta, while the others had plenty. I don't know if this was a trainee's first pressing or if they were running out of magenta partway through the run and were trying to stretch it, but I wasn't happy with the inconsistency. The orange with yellow looked fantastic and sounded very clean. This would remain my favorite variant of all eventual variants. A minor complaint about this first pressing is that the back color came out more green than the original greenish blue. Original, first pressing. I would tweak this for future pressings. The labels and inserts came out great. When pre-orders opened in September, it was another massive burst of orders, and I just began pounding my way through to get everything out the door by the October 1st release date.
Big brother's watching, we watch him back. We see right through his this once or twice is good for your soul.
This one didn't have quite the instant sellout as Only a Lad, but I do believe I was able to move all copies in direct sales over the first month or so before I put in for a second pressing, which would move primarily in distribution. Once again, the feedback was very good and everyone seemed excited for these in the pending Nothing to Fear reissue. When I got the second pressing of Good for Your Soul in May 2022, I rejected it. When I played the final product, there were loud rotational pops that would go on for minutes at a time across the LP on both variants. They obviously used only one set of stampers for the entire run, and they were a mess. After letting a previous bad pressing through, which will be detailed in one of my next releases, I was taking a stand against the quality control issues. When placing an order, you are also provided a chart and are to select a number on the chart to indicate where the hype sticker is to be placed. They completely ignored this and put the sticker in a completely different spot. The manufacturer said they reviewed their copies on hand and confirmed they will repress. Damn right you will. They needed to send me a new set of test pressings from new stampers, and all of this put everything behind more than a couple of months. The way they do these reworks, as they call them, is I have to load the pallet back up and they have the shipment picked up and returned. They reuse the LP covers, inner sleeves, and inserts for the repressed LPs. When the new stock arrived, there were fewer copies than originally pressed, and I found many copies with bent corners. They apparently take a rough approach to tearing off the shrink wrap when they get the returned shipment. I sent the copies with the light bends into distribution. This manufacturer would get worse from here. Nothing to Fear opened for pre-order in mid-October with a release date of November 5th and followed the same pattern of massive orders.
This is my private life. I've got no friends to fear. Wild sex in the working class. After 5, it's a gas.
The color variants on this one were solid green with black splatter and solid yellow with red splatter. I had originally chosen translucent base colors, but after seeing how the Only a Lad variants came out, I modified my color choices to use solid colors. The final products came out very nice, but the green on the album cover was a lighter shade than the original. I also could not get the same exact color balance for whatever reason. The final pressing down the road was done with a different printer, and they came out in even lighter shade of green. The vinyl colors on this first pressing both looked good. The green with black would remain my favorite of all eventual color variants. The yellow with red was something else. I would refer to this one as Canary in a Blender. The insert and labels all came out very nice. I felt I had a good complete set of what I had set out to accomplish. This one would also soon sell out in direct sales, with future pressings moving mostly in distribution. I would also find that future LP pressings were rarely as clean as the first pressings. It seems as these mothers are pulled out and new stampers are created, that noises end up in them and then on the stamper sets. The last of the pressings were often somewhat noisier with clicks and pops than the first pressing. By the end, these last two Boingo LPs moved less than only a lad, but still managed roughly 3,000 units each. I say roughly because there are always casualties in the form of damages and increasingly distribution losses. I eventually found out what label had been the one to get clearances on these early Boingo vinyl titles and decided not to follow through. From what I recall, their thinking was they were not sure of the sales potential, and eventually their clearances expired, making way for my approvals. It certainly worked in my favor. Since COVID hit, the distribution warehouse had a lot of employee turnover, which sadly included the original warehouse contact for my distributor. She was an extremely nice and thorough lady who would investigate any inquiry on stock inconsistencies between the systems. The distribution warehouse has two main systems. One feeds many of the online retailers, the other is for sales and reporting. These do not sync very well at all, and oftentimes the sales reports would show on-hand copies while the feed system showed zero or back order. When the warehouse person would have someone check out the area the inventory was supposed to be located, they would find it and then update the feed system to make those remaining copies available. After she was gone, her replacement quite frankly sucked. He wouldn't put much effort in at all and would just go by the system that said no copies were on hand. On the occasion an effort was made, stock would often be found and was able to move into open orders. But then there were other losses. Both of these Boingo LPs had around 40 copies each go missing. They were not in either system, but my meticulous record keeping showed that what was sent and what was sold were two different numbers. I spent months going back and forth with the distributor and warehouse while I was being asked for original POs and packing slips, all of which I still had. They confirm the numbers of everything they receive, and if they are shorted even one copy, then it appears on the reports. That was not the case for these missing units. The warehouse kept dragging their feet and then would ask for more documentation, like proof of delivery. I was able to go to FedEx and get all of the confirmed and signed for delivery receipts. By the time they finally accepted that they had screwed up and I had proven my side of the story, relations between myself and my distributor were strained. I had tried to leave them out of it and work directly with the warehouse, but this was absolutely not acceptable by the warehouse. They refused to interact directly with labels, and they scolded my distributor for me sending emails directly to those warehouse snobs. Get over yourself. You screwed up and lost, misplaced, or stole this inventory. Why should I inconvenience a go-between who were not part of the problem? These unexplained losses, inconsistencies between systems, and what was sent to the warehouse would continue, and I would just accept that all of those on-hand copies will remain a loss and not move into open orders for the sake of keeping the peace with my distributor as our relationship winds down. In May 2021, I received final clearance for a vinyl reissue of the Ultravox compilation titled 3 into 1. This was a collection from the John Fox era of the band, released in 1980, to capitalize on the success the band was having with new vocalist Mid-Ure and the hit single and album Vienna. Early Ultravox didn't have any big hits, and the 3 albums they released with Fox were all very different. The debut was sort of glam, the second album was very punk, the third was pioneering, being heavily electronic and sophisticated for 1978, predating many artists who would adapt this formula into chart hits by the next year. I got the master list and found the album master had already been archived to high-resolution digital, so I requested a download link. When looking over the list, I saw lots and lots of unreleased material from those Fox years and got excited. I tracked down Fox's management and said I had been cleared to do a colored vinyl reissue of the 3-into-1 compilation, but after viewing all of the unreleased songs in the vault, I was thinking of requesting a CD reissue of the album if I would be able to include some or all of that material. I got a very polite response from management informing me that Fox does not want those songs released and that Universal are aware of his wishes. I acknowledged that I respected the decision, but it pushed aside any idea of a CD version since everything else was still readily available. From a fan standpoint, I was very disappointed because of how much was being left to the cobwebs. No challenges with the remastering or artwork. The original LP cover had very low resolution thumbnails of the 3 album covers on the back, so I did redo those so they looked better. My color variants were a green and black mix from the front of the album cover, with a blue and white mix from the fonts used on the back. When I got my stock in October 2021, I was very concerned. The green and black was pretty good, but the blue and white was another story. I opened a bunch of copies and found that many of them had what looked like sunken little pits all over the surface. When this played, it sounded like a kind of rumbling. There were also some very loud pops baked into each copy. I opened around 10 copies and found only one that did not have this, which I kept for myself. I kind of freaked out, but didn't know what to do. I wanted this released at the same time as the last Oingo Boingo LP, but didn't know if I should view this as a showstopper. Ultimately, I let it go through and felt real nerves about sending it out. It looks pretty.
As the season changed and all the reasons changed, and people came and went.
My hope was that I was being a bit harsh on the critique. Turns out there were some reviews not too thrilled about these shortcomings, while others seemed just fine with it. I couldn't say how many copies were affected by these issues, but I'm guessing it was more than not. I opened about as many of the green and black variant, and only one of those showed the sunken pits and had some of the loud pops. I decided to put the blue and white into distribution, which was often my way of getting variants that were less popular or had issues out of my hands sooner than later. In retrospect, and with the amount of issues with future pressings from this manufacturer, I should have rejected it. As a buyer, I wouldn't have been satisfied with it. Though since vinyl is a secondary medium for me, I'm not sure how much I would have protested. If anything, it's pretty and playable, I guess. With the success of the 3 previous Visage CD reissues, fans had been asking me to put in a request to do the 1984 album Beat Boy. That's the UK edition. That's the US edition. This album has a mixed reputation with fans. Mid-Ure, the primary songwriter for the first 2 albums, would not be involved in this one, and a new band was assembled alongside Steve Strange and Rusty Egan. I put in the request on February 4th, 2020. The plan was to use the cassette remix edition, which was much different than the LP version, and had never been on CD. I also requested a BBC session from 1983 that included very different versions of 3 of the songs. After a couple of follow-ups, my primary contact found the Beat Boy request sitting in his inbox in January 2021, a year after I submitted it. He finally started it moving forward. He definitely needs a little inbox management assistance. The request landed in the final clearance queue in February, a mere month later. The final clearance person asked me for details on the bonus tracks, which I provided. Remember when I said earlier that if a final clearance is anything but quick and easy, it will be put aside and forgotten? By May, I still hadn't heard anything back, so I attempted to follow up, asking her if the BBC sessions are causing a problem, then I can try to work with the BBC myself, since I already had contact info and had communications with them before about sessions. After 2 more days without a reply, I then sent a message to my primary contact about the ongoing difficulties getting responses from this final clearance person, which stated, in part, I don't know if she's like this with all of her clients or if she just has a problem with me, but she has ignored any of the occasional inquiries I've sent over the past several months, even more so than usual. And it's frustrating that I can't even get the most basic info about a select few of my requests, some of the earliest of which I have absolutely no idea if they're even being worked. As much as anyone else, I can understand being busy, but there's a difference between being busy and being rude, and I wouldn't think a response to sending an occasional inquiry, which you have assured me would be perfectly fine, would be expecting preferential treatment. His response was so dismissive, basically stating, we get a lot of requests and do what we can. The impression I had was similar to the one I got from the Sony department head during my phone call with him about the sales manager back in 2018. It seems that they're almost afraid to mention anything to these people in specialized positions, for fear maybe they'll get pissed or quit, and then they'll have an increased workload while looking for a replacement. Talk about marshmallow management. Since I still hadn't heard anything by October, I sent a painfully polite follow-up to final clearance. No response. I kept my persistence in check and held off on another follow-up until November, stating that I will happily remove the BBC tracks and replace with UMG-owned songs to make the process easier. She finally replied and said she'd be willing to look into the BBC tracks. No, I want this damn thing released in my lifetime. Let me make it easier for you since you've made it so unbelievably hard for me. She hadn't even begun to work the BBC tracks in the last year, so I was willing to make the sacrifice. Another reason I wanted to get this out was for the last nearly 2 years since I requested it, I couldn't make a single announcement on my Facebook business page without being asked, what about Beat Boy? It went from being an inquiry to being a nag. Literally every announcement or post was met with, what about Beat Boy? I'd always been forthcoming about my progress or issues, and even though I would respond and say that I hadn't heard anything and would post any updates, it didn't deter the question. I think I got to the point that if I saw, what about Beat Boy, I would just delete it. I finally got the Beat Boy clearance on November 30th, 2021 with my replacement UMG tracks. I quickly sent the list of tapes needed for transfer to the UK side. The tapes were sent out for transfer, which meant I was paying for them. I selected the master for the cassette remix edition, but they said there were some issues with dropouts on one song, so they sent another set. The dropouts were on that one as well, and even noted on the tape box as edge damage. The dropout was so bad that I opted not to repair it and instead replaced the section with a sample from the original version from the previous CD reissue, matching the sound as closely as possible. Some of the bonus tracks I chose were the 12-inch mix of Love Glove and the promo 12-inch mix of Beat Boy, plus an unreleased 7-inch version of Yesterday's Shadow. I had no idea what to expect until I got the tape transfer. Was it a remix? Was it just an edit? Turns out it was just an edit, but a nice addition nonetheless. For the artwork, I chose to use the USA album cover for the front and the UK album cover on the opposite side, making it reversible. The sleeve notes this time were done by a longtime fan who interviewed Steve Barnacle from the Beat Boy Band. The notes had been completed in May 2020, a year and a half before the final clearance was finally received. The CD was released on February 18, 2022.
Give me the love, girl. I'll give you love for a certain walk away now.
The initial sales were about the same as all previous Visage CD reissues, very strong. Once it went into distribution, it sold out quickly and I put in for another pressing. Soon after, sales began to slow, and it was clear the second pressing would be the last, which isn't bad and in line with what I was expecting considering the divided opinions on this album. But since it had been a while since someone got upset with me about something, I got an angry message from the photographer who had the impression that I created the front cover of the CD from his inner sleeve photo. He apparently wasn't aware, or perhaps forgot, that the USA LP cover used that inner sleeve image as the front cover. I politely replied and assured him this was the USA album cover with only the cassette remix edition added, while the UK album cover was on the reverse of the booklet. I also reminded him that several years earlier, I had kindly shared 4 images from my SPK press kit that even he didn't have in his own collection. I received no further response. The general feedback was very positive, with a lot of buyers happy to have this rare remix of the album they thought would never see a CD reissue. I used the term general feedback because there was a very small, but very vocal group of Visage buyers who can only be described as tedious. With every Visage reissue I'd put out, this small group would take to Facebook groups and message boards to post the most petty gripes, sometimes about non-issues or personal fantasy preferences. Things like complaining about demos, dub mixes, non-existent instrumentals that should have been included, or whining that jewel cases make the reissues look cheap compared to a digipack, or that the toms at a specific minute and second within a song just don't sound right. The list went on and on. All I could wonder was why they continued to purchase every reissue if they're obviously never going to be pleased with it. But I answered my own question because they are the types that aren't happy unless they have something to be miserable about. You know what? You be you. It's not going to ruin the party for me or anyone else. I removed myself from those Facebook groups, and this was around the time I had been stepping back from participating in any sort of social media on a personal level anyway. As far as my personal opinion of Beat Boy, it's also very mixed. I didn't even own a copy until I picked up a used LP maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. I didn't think it was as painful as I had read, although the song Casualty does sound like a Bon Jovi karaoke outtake. What the hell is that about? Some songs do outstay their welcome, but Love Glove and Yesterday's Shadow are top-tier tracks. I sent in a request to do the third Divinals album, Temperamental, in March 2021. I bought this album many years ago, but didn't care for the more straightforward rock sound. When I was remastering the Essential compilation LP, I learned to appreciate some of the songs from this album, and after fans had continued to ask if I was going to also reissue this one, I decided to put in a request for it. I received final clearance in February 2022. This began a brief period where I was getting 2 clearances a month, which was great. This would end in just a few months when a major problem would be encountered with 2 of these clearances. When I was putting together the reissue request, I found 4 possible outtakes from the Temperamental recording sessions. I say possible because one tape with 3 of the outtakes had no other released songs, so it's possible maybe this was another artist incorrectly cataloged. It's not like this hadn't happened before, because anyone who knows the song Hanging on a Heart Attack from 1986 and the album it came from was by a band called Davies and not Divinals. Taking into account Chrissy Amflett's Widower's view on unreleased material, I came to what I felt was a compromise. I sidestepped the outtakes, but did include an unreleased extended remix of the earlier hit Pleasure and Pain, which I had discovered on earlier tape transfers. When this was announced, Chrissy's widower was still very displeased with this. I tried to explain to him that I had taken his view into account and didn't ask for the outtakes, but felt with Temperamental being the least popular of the three 80s albums, I wanted to offer something unreleased and better known to help encourage sales. He said that I had crossed the line. Seriously? I put all of this time, money, and effort into the band's catalog that no one else was doing, and this crosses the line? Sounds like someone's being temperamental. By this point in the late 80s, a lot of album masters were being compiled from analog tape to U-matic tape for CD manufacturing. A lot of times, this meant that there were no full, complete analog masters for albums, more so than scattered analog tapes with different versions of songs. Rather than choose a U-matic production master, I tried to rebuild the album from various analog tapes. I requested additional transfers since I found some of the versions on the earlier analog masters I had received for this album were not the same as what was released. As I went through the transfers and rebuilt the album's running order, I compared the versions to my original CD. Turns out I still didn't have all of the exact released mixes. I debated what to do and decided that the differences in the few songs were minimal and went ahead and used what I had. I really couldn't keep requesting random analog tape transfers in hopes of eventually finding the exact mixes, so I wasn't going to obsess about it. Temperamental was released on April 8th, 2022. I quickly realized this one was not going to be as good a seller as the earlier releases, so I quickly put it into distribution. I ended up burned on this one because resellers bought a load of stock from the warehouse that ultimately didn't sell, so nearly 200 copies were returned. The warehouse considers CDs returnable, so if any store or reseller wants to return stock at any time, they can. The way this bites me is that for each return, the payment I received is taken back, and I also have to pay a per-unit refurbishing restocking fee. A further loss comes into play with the evil that is Amazon. I had found that Amazon got an additional 13% off of the wholesale price for no other reason that they're Amazon and extremely greedy. After reviewing return reports, I discovered that when Amazon returns an item, the full amount, including the 13% that they didn't pay, is taken out of my future distributor payments. This makes no damn sense at all that someone else is profiting from the returns of these items while I'm losing money. I would block Amazon from directly stocking my products. I don't need the hassle. When I would see titles eventually show up on Amazon and ask my distributor, "What the hell?" they explain that third parties who buy inventory can choose to list on Amazon, and those do not incur the 13% bullshit since they are not being directly stocked by Amazon. When I would eventually see titles showing up as directly stocked by Amazon, despite my block, I was then told they can buy inventory from resellers rather than directly from the warehouse, and those also do not have the additional 13% off. Fine. Temperamental would struggle to move the one and only pressing, so about half the interest of the earlier CD reissues. And no one seemed to notice the slightly different mixes on the few tracks. As far as my opinion on the album, I still consider it much less interesting than the two previous. It said they were going for a more American rock sound, and that's likely why I find it less interesting. The best song by far is the version of Out of Time, an older song dusted off for these recording sessions. It still retains a college alternative sound, which is likely why it ended up a B-side and a CD bonus track. I'm happy to have completed the 80s trilogy, but the sales confirm why the label dropped the band after this album. In April 2021, I submitted a request to do the Visage 1983 singles collection for a vinyl reissue. I modified it to use the short version of Fade to Gray instead of the dance mix used on the original release, and included the 1984 singles Beat Boy and Love Glove as bonus tracks. This request was to go along with a couple of other vinyl reissues I had put in for over a year earlier in March 2020 for the debut album and the special dance mix album. I got final clearance for the singles collection in early November 2021, and with the requested changes. I was excited by this, but also puzzled why this one came before the other two, which were confirmed to be in the final clearance queue in January 2021. Since the UK already had the singles collection and 7-inch mixes transferred to high-resolution digital, I requested a download and got to work. The singles collection master had a couple of problems in that the song Mind of a Toy had some distortions, and the mix of In the Year 2525 was in mono, as mentioned on the tape box. Fortunately, they had another copy of the master also digitized, and that one proved to be the one to use. For the artwork, I decided to create an insert displaying all of the 7-inch single sleeves, front and back. The color variants I chose were a light blue and gray splatter, for obvious reasons, and a translucent blue with black smoke. When I got the inventory, I wasn't entirely satisfied. The blue and gray was nice, but the blue smoke variant had some occasional noise and came out darker than I anticipated. Not a huge deal, and nothing was a showstopper. The packaging all came out very nicely. Pre-orders opened in late April 2022 and were really strong. By this time, I had a method in place of preparing and numbering packages and then doing the labeling in the evening for shipment the following morning. The release date was May 13th, 2022.
Can't tell the truth, can't tell no lies. Everything you think to us. The silent screams to start the day. You get up early.
These release dates were always for my website. The distribution release dates would be later, and this one would move the rest of the stock fairly quickly. I would eventually put in for a repress, but a manufacturing issue ended up making it smaller than expected. So even though the hype stickers say limited edition of 500, there weren't that many. By the time of the second pressing, I was working with a different manufacturer and found this pressing to be a cleaner sounding and more satisfying pressing, not to mention a really cool color variant. I inquired about the Special Dance Mix album in January 2022. When this landed in the final clearance queue in January 2021, I was asked if this was the same release I had done on CD the previous year, which I confirmed. Dummy me took that as indication of a forthcoming clearance, and I prepared the audio files and started the artwork. After the January 2022 inquiry, she replies and says, "I will check where I left this one and get back to you soon." Apparently, our definitions of soon differ, and I attempted a follow-up in March. No response. It seems her way of selecting which titles to close out is a purely random selection of closing her eyes and pointing to the screen. There's no logic why I got the standard singles collection, and with the modifications, in about half a year when the request for the dance mix version of that same collection was 2 years old, and she was choosing to be unresponsive about it. Along the same lines of being lost in the final clearance black hole, in March 2021, I had sent in a request to do the 1986 solo album by Rick Ocasek titled This Side of Paradise. This landed in the final clearance queue in February 2022, and she asked me about the song Steal the Night, which I was looking to include as a bonus track. She said they didn't show any ownership. I provided her the details that it was an outtake from his earlier solo album Beatitude and had been released on a soundtrack LP. About a month later, I told her that if the song was a problem, we can drop it from the bonus tracks. No response. After a few more ignored inquiries on both of these titles over the next year and a half, in August 2023, I decided to consolidate inquiries on both of these titles in one email and sent to her. Still no response. What the hell is her problem? These are domestic contracts that only require her final sign-off at this point, and she's being her usual difficult self. By the time I would close the label a year later, I would never receive any sort of response on either of these two titles. And that includes mentioning it to my primary contact a couple of times, which he also ignored. I always kept my inquiries stretched out to a month or two so as not to pester. But maybe that was the wrong approach considering how many of these titles had cleared all other departments and were just waiting for her, ended up lost in the void. How's this for an interesting twist? After all of the public postings about his disapproval with the earlier Visage CD reissues, it seems Rusty Egan may have warmed up to the hard-working goofball putting out these releases. In 2022, I was contacted by Rusty's management asking me if I had an interest in putting out a remix of the Rich Kids album he did with Midjure prior to Visage. It seems Warner had given Rusty approval to go back to the multi-track tapes and create a new and improved remix, since people had been complaining for years about how poor the original mix sounds. They told me that Warner do not have the rights in the USA, and that they would be able to license to me to release the remix. I looked on iTunes USA and saw the album listed through Warner, which I shared with them. A couple of days later, management came back to me and said after they had a meeting with Warner about the album, Warner confirmed they don't actually have the USA rights. Well, that doesn't seem to be deterring them from monetizing the album, because as of 2025, it still appears on iTunes USA as being owned by Warner. Since I was busy with a number of other projects in 2022, I hadn't moved forward with the release idea. The fact that Warner were still showing it as their property also did not encourage me to pursue it. But this about-face by Rusty, initially viewing me as the enemy and now coming to me with a possible release idea, seems to point that I'd somehow broken through that hard exterior. Oh, Rusty, you old softy.